My guest today, Kristian Rönn, author of a new book, The Darwinian Trap, The Hidden Evolutionary Forces That Explain Our World and Threaten Our Future. Welcome, sir. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Christopher. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Now, Kristian, you're a CEO and co-founder of Normative, a software tool for sustainability accounting. You've got a background in math, philosophy, computer science, and artificial intelligence, so you're a bit of a polymath. Before you started Normative, you worked at Oxford at their Future of Humanity Institute on issues related to global catastrophic risks, including climate change. Now, you're a thought leader with what's called carbon accounting, and you've had speaking engagements at Davos, Stockholm, 50 plus, appearances in media outlets like Bloomberg and Sky News. And you've advised governments and international bodies and been officially acknowledged for your contribution to the UN goal number 13, which is on climate action. So you have quite the career, sir, and welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit about your latest book. You started off with a wonderful quotation, one of my favorites. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. From my old friend and colleague, Edward O. Wilson. I don't know if you realized, Ed and I used to have lunch when I was at Harvard.
I had no idea. I mean, he's
Yeah,
an absolute legend
he
and
is.
a big inspiration to a lot of the concepts that I write about in the book.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, he was a great guy. He thanked me for a term I introduced to him called epistemic responsibility. He thought this was very key in having people think about why they believe what they do, which is, to me, is the core of critical thinking, really, right? So in your prologue, you talk about uh, Darwinian demons. We'll get into that in a little bit. You mentioned that there's like a demon on a shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder trying to tell us how to behave, how to act, and that sort of thing. Um, you mentioned that you're an entrepreneur, not an academic. Funny, I'm an academic who would very much like to have been an entrepreneur. I'm, yeah, sure that might maybe in my future at some point, but right now it's not. So, Darwinian demons, selection pressures, uh, people engaging in short-sighted, goal-oriented behaviors that over time can actually produce negative consequences. And the term selection pressure, for those unfamiliar with Darwinian evolution, how would you describe a selection pressure?
So I would essentially, I mean, the classical example of natural selection is imagine that you have some, rodents running around in a forest and some hawks circling above. And then obviously the rodents that better fit in with their environment are more camouflaged, will not be killed at the same frequency. So they will have the opportunity to reproduce in greater numbers. So the selection pressure in this context is essentially a sort of catch-all word for different things happening in nature that makes a particular sort of mutation adaptive. So that's what a selection pressure is. And in this case, like you could say that the predatory hawks are sort of, selecting who will be successful. But obviously, there's tons of other selection pressures as well from the environment.
Yeah.
It might be, longevity or how careful and cautious the mice are, or it might be the number of offspring they have. There is a whole host of different things that can sort of be selected for, or a selection pressure sort of acting in a particular direction.
Right, right. And when Darwin mentioned natural selection, it's literally nature selecting what gets to survive and reproduce and what doesn't. So
Yes.
I love your quote here. A world that is mostly ocean creates a strong selection pressure for knowing how to swim or at least owning a reliable jet ski.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. Very good. So like this kind of devil on our shoulder, these pressures often act as kind of like an invisible force, kind of encouraging us to make choices, right? And this can lead, your point is, this can lead actually to unwanted outcomes. Um, the demons are Darwinian because they're directly linked to natural selection. And this is really really interesting how you've phrased this. I'm 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 always happy to see people taking fairly abstract concepts and making them more relatable, uh, to, you know,
And
to people who might
that's
not
what
be
I've tried to
academics.
do here.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Now, you say our inability to adjust our destructive behaviors has put the fate of the whole world at stake. Um, so how do we adjust our destructive behaviors? How do we do this?
Maybe first of all, I could tell you what I mean by
Okay.
that. So in the example I said before with the rodents in the middle of the forest,
Mm-hmm.
it's adaptive for them to have the right level of camouflage. Uh, but there seems to be in nature almost these sort of universal Darwinian drives where in the end of the day, you want to propagate your sort of genetic material to the next generation. And in order to do so, you need resources, first of all. But then in an environment with limited resources, you need power, either to defend yourself from others taking your resources, or if that's the game you play, you might use power to steal resources from
Mm.
others. Um, so these things seem to be fairly universal. So take, for instance, the sort of selection pressure for resource optimization. If
Yes.
you look over time at various civilizations, how efficiently they could extract resources. And imagine sort of the first stone tools where you might be able to cut down a big tree completely in a day. And then compare that to modern forest harvesters,
Mm.
where you can cut down a tree completely and all of its branches in just a couple of seconds. So there seems to be this selection pressure for civilizations to extract resources efficiently. Because with those resources, you can build a civilization that is more powerful than another civilization or society that might decide to live in complete harmony with nature. But that quick resource extraction, which seems to be selected for, has negative consequences,
Mm.
such as the fact that we're in the middle of another mass extinction right now.
Right.
Within our lifetime, half of all species on planet Earth risk going extinct because we're so incredibly efficient at cutting down resources.
Mm.
So that creates sort of an existential risk. But equally, these civilizations that are very efficient at extracting resources, they need weapons in order to project power, to defend themselves from others taking their resources, or maybe steal and conquer neighboring countries' resources. So that means that there has been this selection pressure for more and more dangerous weapons.
Mm.
So sort of imagine the first stone axe again, where you might be able to kill someone in a minute if you're in battle, to nuclear bombs today, where we're capable of like destroying billions of people
Mm-hmm.
in just a few minutes.
Right.
So if you sort of
Kristian,
project that selection pressure going forward, it's
right.
not looking particularly good.
This is a stone axe from the Harvard Stone Age lab. This was around for 1 million years. This
Yeah,
technology did not change. And then fairly recently and rapidly, it all changed. So this brings us back to Ed Wilson's quote again, right? How
yeah,
we have these modern day technologies, we still have kind of, you know, caveman-esque type brains going
for
on.
sure.
Now, you said your hope is that the book can help shift our perspectives away from the pervasive and simplistic bad apples narrative
Yeah.
that taints the public dialogue around global issues and toward more systemic explanations grounded not just in economics, but in other fields too, such as evolutionary biology. So I've worked on a project for decades now called the Relations of Systems Project, or the OzTalk project, the onion skin
Mm.
theory of knowledge, where I look at a lot of different systems and how they interrelate and how they're all connected in a kind of a web. Is this similar to your outlook, that we need to be more in tune with how things are related in terms of the systemic relationship?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, it seems to be the case that whenever there is a problem, we sort of try and find a new thing to optimize around.
Right.
So for instance, if the problem is climate change, we say, okay, we're going to optimize around carbon emissions. But let's say you only optimize around carbon emissions and nothing else. You might have, various types of trade-off as a consequence of, other countries not industrializing, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, personally, I believe that, now we're decoupling, which means that we can, in fact, reduce carbon emissions without sacrificing economic growth. But what I wanted to give you is sort of this example of, if you just focus on one single thing and make that your sole metric of success, then there might be negative consequences. Like, in the end of the day, the best way of reducing carbon emissions is to kill everyone. And clearly, we don't want to do that, right? So we need to have a way of conveying how various things are related, because whenever you optimize around one thing, there might be adverse consequences elsewhere. Like, one example of that is called the poor meat eaters problem, which is sort of the realization that you might want to care about, the well-being of sentient beings, and therefore you want to industrialize societies, but maybe as a consequence, they're also eating more meat, which is creating all sorts of problems with factory farming and other animals.
Right.
So, like, yeah, societies are just full of these examples of how things are interconnected, and we need that interconnected lens, right, in order to progress. So definitely agree.
Excellent. And yeah, this, you mentioned that it requires more nuanced understanding about the causes of what is happening, instead of, chastising each flawed apple. We have to examine the health of the orchard
Yes.
that bears these imperfect fruits. And yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And excellent use of a fruit analogy, sir. Very good. I like that. Now, you say the framework doesn't absolve people from responsibility for harmful actions. Humans are ultimately responsible for their choices, and people who make selfish, antisocial ones should be held accountable for doing so. I agree, but what about those who are just hard determinists and say we don't have any free will, that, we're just as much, a part of the big mechanistic, universe as ants are. Therefore, how do we deal with this issue of free will?
That's a great question. That goes back to my roots in philosophy, I guess. But maybe first of all, like, sort of what I meant, and maybe I can sort of explain it with an
Yeah.
example, right? So, for instance, let's take social media companies. I mean, they're being attacked because the pay for per click sort of model of social media and the feed means that if you post outrageous things that might be totally made up, you get more clicks and you earn more money, right? And you can blame that on Mark Zuckerberg, which would be correct in a way, right?
Yes,
But sort
of
of
course.
imagine a world where they did not invent the feed and they did not invent pay per click in a social media feed. Then maybe MySpace would have done it instead. And they would have survived because there existed sort of this selection pressure for profit maximization within the social media landscape. They just happen to bump onto the best sort of model of doing that.
Right.
So then back to the question of free will in this particular example. I mean, I do think that the universe is deterministic, right? I mean, I think whatever thing I'm saying, I'm doing so because of, my sensory inputs and how my neurons are all wired together. So I think it's all deterministic, but it's down to a bit of how you define free will. So, I mean, you could, for instance, define free will as something that goes against determinism, or you could define your free will as sort of the neural network in your brain that enables you to choose one thing over another given a particular sensory input. And given that definition, we certainly have free will. And back to the question of holding people into account, I do think even if we sort of assume that we don't have free will, like acting in a way where we hold people accountable can create sort of social norms that will make them deterministically act in a way that is more socially optimal.
Right.
So I think it's, yeah, to summarize, it's down to definitions, but regardless of your definition of free will, I think you want to hold people into account regardless.
For sure. For sure. Absolutely. Now, you say we must forge new, more positive selection pressures if we are to break free from these self-destructive Darwinian demons. What would some of the more important ones be in your estimation? More positive selection pressures?
Yeah, so the typical sort of example is the tragedy of the commons, right?
Yes,
That
tell us
you
about
might
that.
have a cod fishery, and if everyone is fishing within the boundaries of which, fish can be replenished, then everyone has plenty to go around. But there might be this selection pressure for one fishing company to profit maximize in the short term. So they just wipe the floor with all of the cods, and there's no cod left for anyone. So how do you solve that situation? I mean, one is through centralized force, essentially saying that here are the fishing quotas. If we see you overfishing, you're going to jail, or we're paying a fine, and the state is using their monopoly of violence to enforce it.
Right.
Another way would be through peer pressure, for instance. Like
Sure.
every other cod fisher would sort of socially exclude whoever is there, and they would get a bad reputation, and nobody would want to trade with them or trade their cod, etc. So that would be sort of a more decentralized way based on reputation rather than a centralized way of doing it through force. So whenever possible, like it seems like the centralized way of doing things can be quite efficient. But when it comes to many of these global coordination problems like climate change or setting up the right governance structures for artificial intelligence or tax avoidance or nuclear weapons, like we don't have one centralized global government. And building one will probably take a bunch of time because it's against the interest of individual states to give up their own power and their own sovereignty. So it's against their own sort of self-interest. So what I imagine instead is a more sort of decentralized global mechanism of mitigating these risks and sort of rewire the fitness landscape and sort of destroy the Darwinian demon selection pressures. And so that's sort of the methods I envision doing that. And I could go into more detail either in this centralized or the decentralized one.
No, that's very good. It's top down versus bottom up. Like we have the ability to affect change rather than just let governments do everything, right? So that's interesting. You mentioned that a lot of these demons, a lot of these ills can be traced back to the same evolutionary phenomenon that leads us to indulge in behaviors that tend to conflict with our collective well-being. Great for the individual, not so good for the collective. Love the use of the cod fishing example because here in Canada, Newfoundland, the Grand Banks, I mean, we lived it. We watched it. We watched it happen and unfold in real time. So, and the tragedy of the commons is basically the example of, what was it, people in England who had pastures, and if everybody used the pastures fairly, all their cattle could graze and everybody would be better off. However, if one or two uh, farmers decided to overgraze and deplete it, then it ruins it for everybody else. So we see this time and time and time again. We see it in traffic when people travel and they decide to cut in and out of lanes, and that causes an accident, which backs everybody else up. Whereas if they had just, right, cooperated. So you're essentially talking about the distinction between cooperators and cheaters, which is a classic
Yes.
evolutionary consideration, that in terms of group activity, cooperation usually results in the benefit for the greater good. It's utilitarian, right? And when people decide to go it alone, it often can be an advantage to them, but to the detriment of the greater good. So it's far less utilitarian.
Yes.
You said, guided by these ideas, you co-founded a software company called Normative, dedicated to recalibrating the societal scales by creating a system of accounting that is better aligned with the things we humans intrinsically value. Can you tell us a little bit more about your company and how it has recalibrated these kind of societal scales?
Great question. So if you look at what makes a company successful, they need to optimize for profit maximization. So, and the reason for that is sort of, obvious. You get more investments, you get more capital, you can hire more people, and you can outcompete everyone else. So that's sort of how financial markets operate. But the rules for how these markets operate are centrally enforced. And with that, I mean, we set up over the past 600 years a legal system that has a particular shape. So first of all, we decided that there is such a thing as a corporation, so an entirely new invention. So it's no longer just people that are sort of entities, it's these groups of people. So, and the way we set it up is that we said that corporations are legally obliged to maximize profits. But in the end of the day, the concept of profit is something that we made up 600 years ago through double entry bookkeeping. So that's just a particular arithmetic for how you compile a sort of balance result report, like a profit and loss statement. So fundamentally, if you want to change the selection pressures from these financial markets, you could reform how we account for success in societies. So that was sort of the core idea of Normative. So the mission of the business is to make known and reduce the sustainability impact of all economic activities on the planet. And we're focusing in particular right now around carbon emissions and carbon emissions accounting, meaning that we can help any business account for their carbon footprint and their operation and their supply chain and value chain. And right now, combined, all of our clients have the equivalent of 1% of global emissions. And we're sort of helping them set net zero targets to reduce emissions. But we have also built sort of this mechanism called the carbon network, which is sort of when you look at, for instance, let's say I'm a big retailer like Walmart. So I can talk about them because they're not one of our clients, but their carbon emissions are the carbon emissions from their suppliers. And the suppliers' carbon emissions is the carbon emissions from their sub-suppliers. So if you can sort of get Walmart to care, they can sort of exert pressure down the supply chain and value chain. And that way you sort of have these decentralized almost nodes that all sort of try to control each other for a particular outcome. And in this case, the outcome is to reduce carbon emissions. So that's sort of the general idea. And so far, we have seen great network effects where, large enterprises in our carbon network sort of push this down on their suppliers, pushing it down on their
Oh, interesting.
sub-suppliers, et cetera, which inspired like one of the mechanisms that I talk about in the book called reputational markets that
Yeah.
I'm sure we will be able to talk more
Yeah,
about.
we're definitely going to be talking about that. Some might think that you place too much faith in the capacity for humanity to be rational.
Right.
We're not. Maybe we're not as rational as we let on. Why do our worst colleagues get promoted? And how is this an example of Goodhart's law in action? Why
Yeah.
do the lousy, nasty types of our fellow colleagues and employees, why do they get the promotions and we don't?
Yeah, no, that's a good example. And you mentioned Goodhart's law, because in the end, it's sort of related to this idea of Darwinian demons and selection pressures. Because in certain systems, you might have a selection pressure for a sort of narrowly defined metric. And then you realize that there are various ways of hacking that metric. So you can, in fact, win by hacking that metric. So imagine, for instance, like a performance framework in an enterprise. Like, the standard way is you need to perform in order to, win and be promoted. But without the well-defined such framework, the most efficient way might be to, go out and have a beer with your boss, maybe do a little bit of nagging, or do a little bit of flirting, or do a little bit of, pressure, or those sorts of things. Or maybe just be, incredibly hot and good looking, which is sort of why people that are better looking get higher paid and sort of more advantages in societies, right? So this is just to sort of exemplify that if the sort of narrow metric here of getting promoted, there are various ways to sort of hack that. It's like just doing a good work is not the only way. But I also give this sort of example of what I learned from being a leader myself, that, the way to prevent that problem is to just have a very good and all-encompassing and sort of systematic performance and growth framework. So it makes it sort of harder to hack the system, right?
Yeah.
But you can see the same problem in everything from, I don't know, like gerrymandering in politics. I mean, the metric is to win the election, right? And the way you hack winning the election is to redraw the districts, so you make sure that you win in the next election. And yeah.
Would Donald Trump be an easy example of how this
Yeah,
can be?
well, I think I think it's sort of more or less standard practice to some extent for both parties to engage in a little bit of gerrymandering. Luckily enough, we have created sort of detection algorithms to detect if gerrymandering is happening, and hopefully will make gerrymandering a bit harder.
Right.
I mean, there's other ways in which, Donald Trump, but also other politicians are sort of, hacking the system, everything from the filibuster to the debt ceiling that we see time and time again. And it's sort of, this taboo is broken, where, someone realizes that, oh, this is actually a way to hack the system to get the legislation passed or to win an election. And then everyone is, oh, this is outrageous, but you're winning. So then over time, there is a selection pressure for everyone to start to do it. Like, the filibuster and gerrymandering first it seemed outrageous, but then it's sort of becoming more and more
Mhm.
common practice, unless the system is fundamentally changed. And going back to the bad apple narrative again, I mean, you could blame every individual who's engaging in these practices, and you probably should. But if you don't go the step further of sort of saying, how can we actually change the system? Like, is
Mhm.
it actually reasonable that the politicians themselves draw the election districts? If you don't take that extra step, like no bad apples mentality on planet Earth will prevent that selection pressure from winning out
Mm.
in the end, which is sort of why I say quote the famous hip hop artist, like, don't hate the player, hate the game.
Yes. Yeah, that was a good line. So is it basically the cooperators are watching cheaters get away with stuff and they're like, well, no, I to heck with this. I'm going to cheat a little. And then they see that and it's like, well, if you're going to cheat a little, I'm going to cheat a little. And so it just generates a kind of a perpetuation of,
Exactly.
right?
Or you decide that you're never going to cheat, and then you're out
Yeah.
of a job because you
Right.
lost.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a car salesman and you're saying, I'm not going to use any psychological manipulation tactics whatsoever,
Hmm.
like, you're not going to be very good at your job. And the ones that are sort of more manipulative will win out in the end. And I
Correct.
mean, we see this in financial markets all the time. I mean, the crisis around like synthetic CDOs and all of those like constructs that made the 2008 financial crisis happen, it was the same thing, right? Where,
Yeah.
okay, it was adaptive to just sort of create these hard to understand and obscure instruments to just, milk a lot of money from a lot of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. This was well portrayed in the movie The Big Short. I don't know if you saw that, but it was
I have seen it. It's brilliant.
it is. It is. Now, you said if Darwinian demons represent the pressures that lead us towards, cheating, essentially, selfishness, then the pressures that promote cooperation can be represented by a different cosmological construct, something you call the Darwinian angels. Can you give us some examples of what these angels would be like?
Yeah, so I mean, there's various sort of mechanisms for that can construct an angel in the end. So I guess like the most straightforward example is back to the cod fisheries. Like, you have a fishing quota, you fundamentally change the game, where you get a lower payout from not cooperating. So then the question is like, how can we fundamentally change the game? And there is this brilliant paper from evolutionary biologist and mathematician Martin Novak, called Five Rules for Cooperation, where he sort of identifies where various ways cooperation can evolve over time, and there can be a selection pressure for cooperation. And one such thing is multi-level selection. So, for instance, you could sort of imagine that societies that don't, where you don't go to war with others in the same flock, and you learn how to cooperate effectively, will sort of be selected for over time. And even Darwin sort of identified that himself as perhaps one mechanism for cooperation and altruism. And you can also look at sort of cancer cells, for instance.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, you
you
mentioned
look at that from sort of multi-level selection perspective, like, okay, why isn't every single cell being selfish and defecting? Well, I mean, then the species, or not the species, but the organism in question would die, and then the entire colony would die, right? So you sort of had over time, as a part of the evolution of multicellularity, these sort of cooperative clusters with cells that sort of exchange resources,
Mhm.
and sort of gradually built a little bit of a wall shielding themselves from everything else. and that was selected for in the end of the day. And then there's other mechanisms beyond multi-level selection, which can be, for instance, indirect direct reciprocity. So that could be sort of your tit for tat game that, if you scratch my back, I will scratch yours. And over time, if we play sort of this game, we will sort of just realize that, okay, we're just better off if we reliably scratch each other's backs, right?
Right, right. In the field, we call this reciprocal altruism.
Yeah, exactly. And then there is, kin selection. I'm not going to deep dive into that one. I don't deep dive into it in the book as well. But the one where I do a deep dive is indirect reciprocity. Because unlike direct reciprocity, where it's, you and me scratching each other's backs, indirect reciprocity is built on the idea of reputation. So it might be that I have a reputation of just being an overly good guy that scratches people's back. And then as I travel to sort of the next city, people know about me as this, overall good guy. So therefore they treat me nicely because I have a good reputation. But if you have a bad reputation as, a snitch or a killer or a molester or whatever, right? Then society is not going to take that very sort of kindly. So that's, I think, is a very interesting mechanism, because unlike, for instance, multi-level selection or kin selection, it doesn't have to operate over evolutionary timescales, because it takes time. I mean, it probably took like, hundreds of millions of years, or I mean, actually billions of years for multicellularity to evolve. And you can sort of debate the reasons why. But one reason is just that level, sort of type of multi-level selection sort of operates at a much slower time scale. And the risks of nuclear war and our need to coordinate around, disarming our nuclear sort of stockpiles and the arms race of artificial intelligence and more dangerous weapons in general, like lethal autonomous weapons. All of these things need global coordination, and we can't wait for sort of multi-level selection to happen. And by the way, I don't know exactly what that would look like. I mean, maybe it could be selection on sort of a cosmic scale, where the planets that don't figure out how to cooperate effectively sort of die off, and those that do actually survive. But I'm a little bit selfish. I rather have us here on planet Earth survive. I'm not just content with someone surviving cosmically somewhere else.
Now, it's interesting. In nature, we see unique relationships, right? With a where you wouldn't suspect that to just come out of nowhere. But I've often thought of the concept of what I refer to as the first brave bird, and this refers to the plover. It's the bird that walks into the crocodile's mouth that is open and eats all the decaying matter. And so the bird benefits and the crocodile benefits because he gets a little tiny dentist to floss out his teeth and whatnot. There must have been one first brave bird that did that, right?
Yes.
And so how do we get the first humans to adapt to using these Darwinian angels? Like, isn't that the really tough thing for them to realize, hey, this is a good idea? Isn't that going to be a kind of a large learning curve?
No, I think that's an excellent example again of sort of, biological selection happen over large time scales, because I could imagine that there must have been like hundreds of thousands of years with this sort of delicate dance where, sometimes birds get killed, sometimes it pays off going in, and sometimes it doesn't pay off going in. And it's a little bit uncertain until we have sort of a new evolutionary equilibria where almost all alligators realize that, okay, it's just it's just better to have these birds around. And every bird doesn't even think once. I mean, they don't, need to be overly cautious. They know that the, crocodiles are not going to do anything regardless. So you
Mhm.
probably had this long dance, but we don't have time for that long dance, right?
That's
So
right.
how do you make the first bird happen quicker? And that's when I go back to this idea of indirect reciprocity, and especially the idea of reputational markets as a mechanism for indirect reciprocity.
Right.
So essentially, when you look at the global system, like every single dangerous technology that threatens the world is an interconnected, complex value chain of components and people and capital inputs. And I
Mhm.
have this example in the book with a guy from YouTube. He decided to do a chicken sandwich from scratch. And it sounds super easy. You just take the chicken from the fridge and, then you make the sandwich and then you're done. But what he meant was truly from scratch. And
Mhm.
that was like, growing the grain, milling it, and then, feeding the chicken and then, slaughtering it. And it took him 6 months, and it costed him 1,500 US dollars. And then, even then, he didn't do it completely from scratch, right? Because he probably didn't use stone tools for the milling, etc., etc. So, I mean, if you were sort of a Stone Age person and you had none of the infrastructure around, like it
Mhm.
would have probably taken you even longer to make that chicken sandwich.
That's
So the
right.
chicken sandwich, in fact, has a very complex value chain and technology tree. But equally so, like nuclear weapons, dangerous engineered pandemics, which I predict will be a huge risk in the future, rogue AI, all of them are incredible marvels of cooperation across these value chains. So if we could somehow build a system where irresponsible biolabs wouldn't get access to lab equipment,
Mhm.
where irresponsible AI labs wouldn't be getting access to compute resources.
Right.
If we sort of had this world where we could have this, universal reputational ledger for some of these entities, we would in fact be a lot safer, because right now, like, these value chains are not particularly transparent. Like, companies don't particularly care who they sell something to. And if they do, there's sort of ways of avoiding it, because you can just sort of set up a shell company and,
Right.
and buy the things and then sell it to the other sort of bad actor. So the whole idea of reputational markets is a way to let markets decide who has a good reputation, and then sort of utilize that interconnectedness to sanction players that have a bad score.
Mm. Oh, that's good. You mentioned, unlike cancer or viruses, humans have the chance to intentionally guide our future development according to principles of rationality, empathy, and long-term planning. This aspect of humanism may not just maybe not just our own saving grace, but the saving grace of life itself. My job at Convergence is to raise awareness regarding the race to develop very powerful forms of AI.
Yeah.
I noticed later on in the book you talk about what people can do in this regard. Um, can you tell us a bit about Megacin and their biological weaponry using AI as an example? I thought that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, sure. So I bring this example up in the book to just exemplify that, artificial intelligence, it's not just something that is sort of dangerous many years and into the future. It can actually, it's a dual use technology in the sense, just like normal human intelligence. I mean, we humans can use our intelligence to produce nuclear power, clean energy, fossil free, or we can use it to produce nuclear weapons. So I bring up this example of this company that they sort of flipped a sign in the AI where instead of creating various types of chemical compounds that would be beneficial, they flipped the sign of, okay, how do we make the AI create something or imagine something that will harm the human body as much as possible? And the result was that they discovered, I think it was 40,000 new dangerous chemical weapons in just a couple of hours. Like the type of weapons that would take humans an incredibly long time to create. So this is to sort of exemplify that these risks are not far away. I mean, they're sort of already happening, and there is, you know, AI being used to scam people out of, you know, millions. So we need to be quite concerned about sort of misuse of AI today.
Yeah, that was quite the surprise for a number of us in the field to see how quickly it could produce such harmful agents so readily. And of course, this is what we're trying to consider moving forward is, you know, there are certain countries that might want to not cooperate, shall we say, and try to get a little bit more of the common pasture for themselves, as it were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think this is sort of a problem, right? And
Mhm.
this is why I think, I mean, the technical alignment problem, creating artificial intelligence that is aligned with human values. It is
Yes.
incredibly hard. But what makes me worried is that it might not be enough. So I bring up this example of self-driving cars. So, I mean, you could sort of see self-driving cars as a modern version of the trolley problem. Should the car be programmed in such a way where it just reduces harm for all people, not just the drivers? You could imagine this situation where you're in your self-driving car on a bridge and a truck is, you know, coming towards you. And one way you could sort of save yourself is to drive up on the sidewalk, but that would risk the lives of, you know, maybe 5 other people. And perhaps the best way of you know, maximizing human lives here would be to just take the hit, or like, you know, drive off the bridge on the other side, you know, down the cliff. So when asked, people said that, of course, we want self-driving cars to minimize harm for any people. But then when asked simultaneously, would you buy such a car yourself? Most people say that they wouldn't. They would buy the car that actually maximizes their own chances of survival, or the chances for their family to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Here we have a classic example of sort of tragedy of the commons again in the realm of AI. And I think, like, when I look at AI systems being deployed, right? Like when it's being deployed as advisors to CFOs in large enterprises, I mean, will the company procure an AI model that is trying to optimize everything going well for humanity? Or will they deploy an AI model that is maximizing the profit for that particular company? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
as a matter of fact, they should probably get fired, or, you know, maybe even sued if they recruit an AI model that is not maximizing profit. I mean, after all, they're legally obliged to maximize profit,
That's
you know.
right.
Similarly, if you deploy AI in the military, like, okay, do you want to do so in a way where you are guaranteed to win at the expense of your adversaries? Or do you want the AI to be sort of, a happy-go-lucky hippie that want to save as many lives as possible? Like, probably not. So, I mean, we have these market forces and selection pressures for
Yes.
selecting AI that is not aligned. So even if we solve the problem, it's unclear to me that we will select the aligned
Yes.
AI. So that's why we sort of need to almost solve a civilization alignment problem
Hmm.
as well in order to avoid dangerous AI arms races or nuclear weapons
Yep.
arms races or bioweapon arms races.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I cover that in my book as well. I mention it's one thing to put the ethics into the machines, but what about the ethics of the ones putting that into the machines? Have we worked that out yet? Right. So,
Exactly, for sure. Very excited to read your book, by the way.
oh, well, thank you. You mentioned artificial intelligence may well represent the next step in the ongoing evolution of cognitive capacity. Are we ready for this as humans?
I don't think we are. I
No.
mean, if you look again at sort of these almost Darwinian drives, I mean, everything else being equal, being more intelligent is an adaptive trait.
Right.
And of course, like within rhyme and reason, I mean, the reason why we didn't have something like human brains straight away is that you need a lot of energy and resources for this particular type of brain. So without like a lot of fat and readily available sort of meat and food in the savannah, we probably wouldn't have sort of involved this type of brain. Or,
Right.
I mean, it could have been, fish-rich diets or other things as well, right? But if we take sort of the same concept then and apply it to artificial intelligence, the fact is that similarly to how we humans dominate all other life on the planet because we're more intelligent, the same thing would happen with AI. There is no examples whatsoever of a less intelligent organism subjugating and overpowering a more intelligent organism.
Right.
I mean, you could sort of say, you do a little bit of sort of a straw man argument and say, well, that's happening all the time with viruses and et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, the fact is that we know how to kill those viruses as well. We figure that out through, vaccines and we figured out how to kill bacteria through antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, we are definitely the ones who are in control over the future destiny of the planet. But once we invite AI into the scene and we make them more intelligent, like who is natural selection gonna favor in the end of the day? It's probably not the less intelligent humans.
Hmm. And humans haven't had a great track record of being number two. We we kind of
No,
like being number one.
for
So,
sure. And I mean, we killed a bunch of other hominids
yeah,
in the process as well. I mean, we don't see
absolutely.
them around because they probably were not as intelligent but also not as good as cooperating. So we have sort of this lethal mix where we know
Hmm.
how to sort of do both. Um,
Yeah, you say currently global citizens lack a voice in the critical debate surrounding these developments. Indeed, most people are not even aware of the very real risks that AI might present to our everyday lives. Instead, all humans on Earth have become unwitting participants in a vast, non consensual experiment. I'm trying to raise as much awareness as I can about AI existential risk. I've often thought of how few people around the world really know what's going on in the race to build a super intelligent machine god. Do you think they're going to be a bit upset when they find out?
I think so for sure.
Yeah.
Like these AI labs, I mean, they are talking about achieving AGI before the end of this decade. So AGI, by the way, I mean, it's not sort of very specific in terms of its definition, but the overall definition goes something like this, you know, where you have an AI agent being better than humans at almost any task. So then if you look at what would the consequences of that be? I mean, if you have a profit maximizing enterprise, will they keep humans around? I mean, probably not. And a lot of people are not going to have any jobs whatsoever. And I think pretty quickly we will sort of be alienated from the entire world economy. I mean, I think there is going to be this gradual selection pressure for AI to do more and more of the decision making, and we're going to willingly give that power up. I mean, in the end of the day, like if an enterprise is more competitive when they listen to everything that the AI advisor says, even though you might not fully sort of understand it, of course you're going to listen to the AI advisor. And similarly, politicians are probably going to listen to their advisors, AI advisors, telling them like, how do you optimize the chances of winning your election? And at the same time, more and more people will be sort of pushed out of the workforce. So I think things could happen quite quickly. And I mean, the debate is obviously, you know, is it before the end of the decade, or is it longer? Is it mostly sort of hype? Because after all, you know, in the Silicon Valley landscape, it seems to be a selection pressure for doing a bit of hyping and sort of fake it till you make it type mentality. But, you know, in the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter too much if it's, you know, 3 years or 10 years or 15 years. You know, at some point, we will not be the dominant species on the planet. And this is all due to a few large AI labs harvesting all of our data and creating sort of, you know, digital clones of ourselves without us really consenting to it, without us really having a chance to even have a vote on, you know, do we want to build these, you know, future digital gods? And I think it's absolutely outrageous. I mean, it is absolutely outrageous that we have businesses that are like building these digital gods with the capacity of replacing us. And they're even sort of admitting themselves that, you know, these things are posing existential risks. I mean, all of the CEOs of these businesses signed the case statement saying that we believe that AI is an existential risk, and yes, yet they're sort of pushing ahead. But I also mentioned in the book that, you know, I don't know to what extent we can blame the CEOs and the leadership of these companies, because they're also sort of a victim to these Darwinian demons.
That's right.
I mean, like, if they don't push ahead, someone else will. I mean, that's the definition of an arms race dynamic. You know, if Anthropic, for instance, went ahead and said, you know, we will only sort of focus on alignment and nothing around capabilities. We will no longer release any commercial models. Like, you know, nobody would invest in them, and they would no longer be a player in the race.
You're
So
right.
from their perspective, it's rational to sort of race ahead, because then at least me, as sort of the more ethical player, I am at least a part of the race. So I do think it is a little bit of a dilemma, and I'm not at all envious of the leadership of these companies. I mean, they have a huge responsibility. They know that they have a huge responsibility, and they know that, you know, if they don't race ahead, you know, then the board might fire them. I mean,
Yes.
if the board doesn't fire them, you know, the investors might fire the board. And
Yes.
it's quite interesting because I wrote down that exact scenario in the book. And as I was doing the writing, the whole OpenAI saga unfolded, right?
Right.
With the board firing Sam Altman, and then ultimately the investors winning out, and in this case Microsoft firing the board, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, if they didn't do so, if the CEO of Microsoft said, we will not engage, then maybe their shareholders would have fired him. So
Exactly.
it is a very, very, yeah, hairy situation, to
Mhm.
say the least.
Mhm. Yeah, I mentioned similar uh, historical events unfolding in the AI biz with Altman and and what was going on there. Um, Turns out a number of drivers is money, clearly, but also human curiosity. Like they're very much driven by wanting to be the first. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
To build this god to be the ones to pull it off.
be the
In
pioneers.
your, it's just yeah, and it's unfolding before our eyes in real time, and it's just
Yeah,
incredible how few people really know that this is going on. That these major companies, these big tech companies, are trying to outmuscle each other and spending hundreds and hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to be the first to pull this off because of the competitive edge that they
yeah,
believe it will give them in making even more money and gaining
yeah,
more resources and don't let's not forget status is in there
yeah,
a little bit as well, right? These some of these players want to be, the discoverers. They want to be you know, the
for sure,
Newtons of their day, right?
for sure.
Now, in your final chapter, just like in the final chapter of my book, it's directed towards what people can do. So let's finish off by talking about that there is hope, that this isn't entirely a pessimistic, dystopian future that awaits us. We're actually players right now, and that each of us has a voice. And you mentioned we've found ways to successfully reset the incentives in environments in ways that have made it adaptive for agents to cooperate rather than compete or cheat. The
Yeah,
existential threats that we face today are very real. But the good news is that we already know what we have to do in order to address them. By embracing mechanisms for cooperation and choosing to consort with Darwinian angels, we can thwart the demons that would destroy us and perhaps even defeat them entirely. Now, I find that the main reason we're currently in this predicament is because we humans eventually developed and evolved consciousness,
yeah,
right? We have the ability to understand what our place is in our environment, and then we can actively take measures to pursue goals that we deem to be valuable on some
yeah.
level. And now we're consciously racing towards the building of a super intelligent machine god. And you're hoping some Darwinian angels can secure our salvation. And I'm with you. I'm with you on this. How? How do you think this can happen? What can the public do now that they now know about what's going on in the world with
So
AI?
it all depends on what position you're in, right? So, I mean, in this chapter, I talk about people in different positions in society. So, I mean, something that anyone can do, right, is to try and raise the issue, like talk to friends, talk to family members, vote for politicians that want to change the system instead of sort of just rehashing the same old, bad apples narrative and political opponents being evil, etc., etc. I mean, that's something that anyone can do. And I think, anyone can also do a little bit of civil disobedience. I mean, it can be healthy, to go out there and protest and show like, the big tech companies that you really care about this issue. So these are things that everyone can do. But then you might be in a position of power, and it can be power in various degrees, right? I mean, if you work for an investment firm, for instance, you can think about like, how do you spend that money? Or even more so, like if you work for a pension funds. And I think pension funds are quite interesting because they are sort of starting, or at least some of the sovereign wealth funds are sort of having more of a holistic perspective of, it is in my fiduciary duties to make sure that the preferences of all of the, citizens within this sovereign wealth fund are having sort of a flourishing future they can sort of say, okay, let's build, frameworks for, responsible AI, or let's build frameworks for, responsible bio companies. And we're not going to invest in anyone unless they have sort of these frameworks in place. And moreover, if you are, for instance, a politician, you can decide to be a little bit brave and actually prioritize like the questions around, AI and existential risk and so on. And yeah, I mean, that's something that, Sunak, for instance, did in the UK, and that I think was one of his greatest achievements. I mean, if you compare him to the Labour government on, for instance, climate change, it's Labour better hands down. But he was, at least in my opinion, brave in terms of saying, okay, let's have this summit, let's build a task force, let's make UK a leader in the governance of artificial intelligence. So yeah, those are just sort of a few examples. I think everyone can do something in the end of the day.
No, that's good. You said the most striking aspect of this new world is how human cooperation has evolved. No central force or dictator micromanaging every action. Every individual or company or government can act in harmony with its neighbors. Kind of a core DNA encoded in what you call reputational market.
Yes.
And this is you mentioned earlier, this decentralized approach gets rid of the need for kind of an Orwellian overlord surveillance state and replaces it with a system that naturally encourages positive behavior. And I'm totally on board with you on this. You're talking about modifying current capitalist-based economies and shifting them to kind of a more reputational-based global
Yeah.
economy. You quoted Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, at the beginning of your book. He also had another quotation regarding kind of a socialist, these types of socialist economies. He said, "Great idea, wrong species."
Yeah.
He sees bees cooperating, right, and other types
Right,
of,
right.
hive insects, and they cooperate. Ants, of course, was his specialty, and they succeed extremely well. Why? What's with humans though? Why can't we get this notion through our heads that cooperation actually will result, as and Hobbes pointed this out,
Yeah.
centuries ago, that if you just give up a little bit of liberty, you just give up a little bit of your freedom to do anything you want, then you get most of what you want. But it
Yeah.
requires that cooperative element. Why does it take humans so long to figure this out, that cooperation actually will be better for them in the long run? What's going on there?
That's such a great question. And I mean, I don't know that I have the full answer, but I mean, I have sort of my own intuition.
Mhm.
And I think you made a comparison with, bees and ants, right? I mean, they're quite similar to sort of the Star Trek Borgs, the
Yes,
overall hive
that's
mind.
right.
They're genetically programmed to be super cooperators. Uh, and we can also cooperate at larger scales. But that's not because our brain is sort of, hardwired to do the ultimate sort of, I don't know, communists, Borg sacrifice. But we are cooperating as sort of, intelligent individuals because we care about our reputation. I mean, we know that if we behave like an asshole, this is going to follow with us. I
Mm.
mean, and let's look at the Me Too movement, for instance, like once you get that label of, okay, I've been a part of sexual assault, then that is very, very hard to sort of wash away. So I think that for us humans, unlike ants that are like really hardwired at a base level. I mean, the way us humans do it is through sort of, carrots and sticks related to your own reputation. And that's why I think this idea of reputational markets can be so incredibly powerful. So, I mean, like if you take any, and I don't think I fully sort of explained how it works, but if you take any company in the world, if you take like an AI lab, Irresponsible AI Inc., for instance. I mean, I'm just making a company up now, not to point any fingers. So if they would have a low reputation and the result would be, okay, they're not going to get access to talent anymore, they're not going to get access to their GPUs, etc., etc., it would make a huge difference. So then the problem is like, how do you set that reputational rating in a way that is sort of dynamic, first of all, but then also represents our true preferences? So the idea with a reputational market is based on the idea of a prediction market. So you sort of, people within that market vote, what things do we intrinsically value? We might value sort of future beings, we might value happiness, we might value nature, or a few of those things. And then you can post prediction on that market, saying, for instance, okay, Irresponsible AI Inc. Will enable a major terrorism attack before 2025. Right. And then you can sort of vote on that particular assertion, similar to how you vote on outcomes in a betting odds, for instance. So you could vote on these different predictions related to things that we intrinsically value. And based on the aggregation of all of those predictions, I mean, one other might be, okay, what will the carbon emissions of Irresponsible AI Inc.'s data centers be? So if you sort of take all of these predictions together, it gives a view, a collective view of how different experts predict that a particular entity will affect the things that we value. And that could sort of create this dynamic score where you're actually incentivized to be truthful and have true predictions. And that way, hopefully at some point, someone in the value chain of Irresponsible AI Inc. would say, hey, I'm not going to provide lithography machines, or hey, I'm not going to provide the minerals if they end up in chips that, is provided to Irresponsible AI Inc. So if you have this sort of global ledger, it is sort of enough for one influential player in the supply chain or value chain of Irresponsible AI Inc. to care, for the rest of the sort of network to care. So that's sort of the overall idea. And hopefully, if we implement this in the right way, we can live in a much safer world where, everyone is actually incentivized to optimize around the things that we intrinsically value in the long term, instead of optimizing for short-term fitness or survival, because that's in the end sort of the problem, that evolution through natural selection is sort of this short-sighted optimization algorithm where it literally just cares about, what is in the next generation. Is this more adaptive? Yes, it is. Is this more adaptive? Yes, it is. But us humans, we can actually look far into the future. So unlike, bacteria that created, other mass extinctions and climate change in the past, and we can see this in the geological record, us humans can sort of predict and break those sort of selection pressures. And hopefully it will be enough for us to go out and colonize the galaxy and do a lot of awesome things. So that was a bit of a long monologue.
No, that's good.
But,
And I love the hope. You finished the book by saying our generation can mark the dawn of a cosmic odyssey, where humanity, armed with the gift of cooperation, embarks on a voyage to spread the light of life and beauty into the dark, cold, and vast cosmos. It's a great and hopeful outlook for our future, I feel you're right. Like, you resonate very well in my limbic system. But my prefrontal cortex hopes like heck that you're not wrong. Because,
Yeah, exactly.
right? You place a fair bit of faith in humanity, and I don't know. I've had George Carlin's daughter on the podcast, and I've watched his career as a comedian go from a stoic to a skeptic to a cynic. And
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm following the same lower trajectory, where I don't share maybe the same hope you do for the intelligence of humanity or their ability to be rational. And I hope I'm wrong about this. Your solution may just be able to be the thing that can save us or help save us and make the world a far better place. And I hope you're not wrong about your optimism about the rationality of our species. But man, you really hit the nail right on the head. Cooperation is key. There's just no
Yeah.
question about that. We live in a Hobbesian world, whether we want to admit that or not.
Yes.
And if we don't all cooperate when it comes to the development of AI, we may all lose. That's the thing we're going to have to really get the message across. So, I really think you've given us a wonderful blueprint moving forward, and a great hope for the future. And I just want to take this time to thank you for coming on this podcast. I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks a lot. It was my pleasure, and thanks for the great and interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Take care.